Welcome to the Africa Speaking Podcast. The podcast discusses critical issues about the African continent. It is brought to you by Toyeza Communications in Nairobi. My name is Kimani Njogu. Today, I'll be talking with Chief Justice Professor Willy Mutunga, and we will be focusing on the question of radical Pan-Africanism. So, Chief Justice Mutunga, if you could start with this whole question of the concept of Pan-Africanism. Where did it actually begin? Because it seems like it's a constructed idea. Where did it begin?
I guess historically, we might trace it to maybe, Manchester 1945 or even beyond that. But if we start there, 45 in Manchester, it could have been a continuation of that idea, because I think we cannot ignore the anti-colonial struggles that are also happening all over the place against the British Empire. And so Manchester was radical, in terms of what? Decolonization. That narrative of decolonization and freedom is what, when we get independence, all over the place, people say actually that was a revolution. Because if you have been dominated and exploited and oppressed for 68 years and you get that to a space like we did in 63, there has been a lot of arguments saying because of the linkages and the continuities, we should also look at those events and happenings as revolutions. But that's anyways a debate for another day. But when you take 45 and you
Manchester experience,
yes,
which brought together, I think, people from the Caribbean, Africa, in the United States, right?
Yeah, because Pan-Africanism, we can't confine it to the continent of Africa. There is what we call the African world. That became very clear when George Floyd was killed and Black Lives Matter exploded.
Yes.
And Celeza, did a great job of...
Paul Celeza.
Yes. Professor. He tracked the demonstrations, which showed clearly where the African world is. The continent of Africa itself on that issue of Floyd, was mute, except for Kenya, I think South Africa, and some
Nigeria,
other. Nigeria also. But we could have been more robust. So I was just basically connecting this radical idea to all those struggles, not just in the continent, but whether they happen, in the diaspora, where people are fighting against slavery, and all manner of things. So after Manchester, obviously, you have to come to Badung in 1955, because also idea of people saying, we can't have a unipolar world. We've got to have multipolar world so that there is balance. And this is now the Asian and African countries, and later the non-aligned movement, takes place.
So kind of a solidarity of community of nations that have, histories that are connected.
Yes.
Maybe histories of oppression, histories of domination and so on.
And occupation. Yeah. We are right. And when it comes to 58, if we are now coming back to continent, Accra happens.
Yes.
And Mboya is there, Nkrumah is there, Lumumba is there, and what is radical about that? It's people to people.
Yes.
Pan-Africanism.
Yes.
It's not states. States come later with OAU. That's people to people, with trade unions, women's movements, embryonic political parties.
So kind of horizontal, with the mutual respect, it's not the political elite kind of dictating.
No. The states are out of it. And that's why when Shivji now talks about resurrecting radical Pan-Africanism, he is attacking the states. He says that states are the ones that destroyed people to people radical Pan-Africanism.
So, before 1963, what we were seeing then was a kind of people-driven
Yes.
Pan-Africanism,
Yes.
which is a form of resistance
Yes.
against all sorts of dominations, whether
Yes.
it's slavery, whether
Yes.
it's colonialism,
Yeah.
and so on.
Yes, under domination of these emerging elites who have now occupied colonial states, and they are not changing them. They are not dismantling them.
It seems like the solidarities with the continent of Africa and the Caribbean,
Yes.
the African diaspora,
was
very solid.
Yes.
And are we losing it by the time we are coming to 1963 when
I think
political
so.
elites...
I think so. It's a retreat there. Although when you look at what happens with independence, there are people like the guy who lived in Ghana, Du Bois.
Yes, W.E.B Du Bois. Yeah.
Yes. And in the case of Kenya, we also have Padmore.
Yes, Padmore.
Celebrated.
Yes. Correct.
Okay. Who else? Ralph Bunche.
Yes, Ralph Bunche. Yes,
okay.
Absolutely. Yes.
You know, so the independence, there is tokenism.
And also, I think when you think about the Black Panther movement and them moving to Tanzania, to Arusha, as a point of reference, as a point of retreat, it seems that...
That's actually a brilliant point on this issue we are discussing. Because Tanzania becomes a base, not just of the African liberation movements, ANC, Frelimo, SWAPO, the ZANU PF and ZANU whatever. In that, that's when I was studying there then. Polisario was there. PLO was there. Black Panther you mentioned. Black Power.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah, absolutely.
Vietnamese. And there was also Tuparos from Uruguay.
Wow.
So
South America was also present in Tanzania.
Yeah.
That's what I mean, of course,
that's a very important point of answering that particular question, or basically saying, look, we might have retreated, but now I don't think we retreated because Tanzania became the epicenter of those movements. And for your information, Che Guevara was in Tanzania when he went to Congo, DRC, okay?
Yes.
And this is now documented in a biography by his wife, his Cuban wife. And there are even photographs of
Che Guevara in Tanzania.
Yeah, but totally disguised.
Yeah.
But now, that is another very important milestone of those connections that we're talking about, because Che Guevara was also about a revolution,
absolutely,
in Africa. But I think we could say, as you are suggesting, there are retreats and I think the consolidation of radical Pan-Africanism will happen when those solidarities come back.
Let me take you back a little bit to the early 1960s, when this idea of United States of Africa is being discussed, and Kwame Nkrumah is really pushing it, in a sense.
And Nyerere is talking about the regional ones.
Absolutely.
Until 1997, when he... acknowledges that Nkrumah was right and he was wrong.
So looking back at that history, it seems as if there were two trajectories to the continental solidarity. So there was the first one, which was driven by Nkrumah. Let us have the United States of Africa right away at independence. And Nyerere arguing that really we are not ready to do this, but we can do the regional integration. And he seems to have won in that.
I think even in the biographies that have come out, Nyerere's intellectual biography done by Yaya and Kamanza and Shivji, I believe that issue is taken, and the very bitter exchanges that happen in Addis between Nkrumah and Nyerere on that issue.
But you see, we cannot judge Nyerere too harshly because...
No. I think this is... Nyerere's position was understandable in the sense that we have the first union, Zanzibar and Tanzania. And then there's the embryonic East African community. And the West Africans are also doing the same thing. So as an intellectual and ideological and political idea, it's not that it was reactionary. I think they were trying to see, what within those two versions, which one was going to work. And the history now records that Nkrumah is the one that should have been followed because
now we can see and it seems it seems that the way Nyerere may have imagined this is so the idea is a construct. We are building an identity.
Yes.
And the way you build identity is that you build identity from the very local level and then expand outwards. So you start from the family identity to the ethnic identity, national identity, regional identity, and then Pan-African identity. But Nkrumah is saying, no, look, we can actually go direct.
It was a great debate. And 97 Nyerere said Nkrumah was right upon reflection. I agree with you. It didn't mean that he was wrong. His thinking also has some socialist ingredients that you build from the grassroots. The solidarities, begin in two countries and then, other countries. And then you go, up. But in terms of the political aspects of it, a United States of Africa at that point, and the issue of Gaddafi reminds us very well about this, where they would have been talking about not just decolonization and helping other countries from apartheid and colonialism, particularly the Portuguese colonies and so forth, but also economic issues.
Absolutely.
About how you secure the African resources, how Africa should have its own currency, which is what Gaddafi, apart from the unity, he went into the economics of it and into the resources of it, and basically saying, Africa now, we need to have our own currency, encouraging the French ex-colonies to accept his money so that they pay off the French and they are free. That's an economic thing.
So, again, going back to Nkrumah, where he says, seek ye the political kingdom and everything else will fall in place. So he focuses on the whole question of liberation, political liberation of the African continent. And then you move on to now the economic and you move on to the social integration and so forth and so on. I was wondering if before 1963 the Pan-Africanism is being driven by the people, and then the political elite take over in 1963 through the Organization of African Unity, OAU. How come that the voices of trade unions and the voices of ordinary, Africans, just in the continent as well as the diaspora, suddenly start becoming muted? They start becoming silenced in this idea.
It's a great question, which has also bothered me, and my own interpretation of it or hypothesis is that, again, going back to what I was saying, that independence was seen as a revolution by many of us, people who struggled. Even that's how Mau Mau, Land and Freedom Army, was betrayed.
Yes.
Okay, the people basically see this other victory and they basically say, okay, the British are leaving and so forth, so let's consolidate on this. And where there were forces in the Kenya Land and Freedom Army that were saying no, and they were going back to the forest. We've got to track that resistance. There was resistance, quite clearly identified the correct political line. But the euphoria and what is happening and so forth, state becoming now the post-colonial state,
because nothing gets dismantled. It's a continuity of the colonial state. The same infrastructure, the same mentality.
Yeah, and the growing up in the 50s and 60s, I can tell you, we all felt this progress. We're going to school and we were being told, you are going to be the black rulers. The white ones are going, there's apartheid is being dismantled, the colonial apartheid system in Kenya and other places. And so this visible progress, driven by now the embryonic compradors, the political elite all over Africa, okay, disrupts these particular considerations until very quickly, like in the case of Kenya, after how many years? Not many. We start realizing that there was no independence. We start realizing that the people have been lied to. Our unions start being smashed. KPU is banned. Detentions.
Early 1960s, barely like 3 years after independence.
Yeah, there is that split between the nationalists, Kagia, Pio Gama Pinto, who is murdered in 65, Jaramogi, and
then
then
Akumu.
Yes, and their Wananchi Declaration, you read it, it is very, very, very progressive. Even when it talks about Pan-Africanism, it's talking about solidarities between unions, women's movements, youth movements, and anti-imperialist political parties, which is against people to people. But our historians never track resistances to these dominant ideas, because somebody should have tracked that to basically show, yes, there was euphoria, but it didn't last 6 years, and people started even talking about a new constitution. The independence constitution was colonial and whatever. So, and I think Shivji, when he talks of the resurrection, I think is tracking that. And I think that book, I read it a while back. I should read it again in view of your brilliant question to see whether he tracks, this retreat by people to people solidarities. And of course, in our case, unions were also banned.
Yes, absolutely.
Women's movement, Kanu made sure that they became appendages.
The co-optation of the trade unions by the state. And of course, I think that what was also happening at that time, which again destroys the Pan-African solidarities. Because if you look at the pre-60s, there are solidarities not just within the continent, but also across the continent. But the cooptation, the Caribbean world, absolutely. But now with the cooptation, they become more nationalistic in terms of their view. And they seize the connections.
And they are caught up with the national, struggles. And then the states now in 63 basically tell us that Pan-Africanism is going to be driven by states. And at that point, the states we are talking about in 63, from the embryonic political classes and so forth, are sellouts.
Absolutely, because they have been midwifed, as it were, by the departing colonial regimes.
Yes, and they have occupied the colonial state structure, and they are very comfortable with it. You look at the Kenya thing, the handshake, the first handshake in 64, political handshake, that smashes the African People's Party of Ngei, KADU, and then they come together. Okay? And
then the assassinations begin.
Assassinations begin. Then Ngugi, I think, argues that merger, that handshake in 64 was terrible because it strengthened the hands of the compradors in Kanu. And that's why the split happens in Limuru when Kagia and Jaramogi and Dennis Akumu and others basically say on issues of land, on issues of invisible government that Odinga talks about in 67, in 64. 67 is when he publishes his book. Coincidentally, same time as The Reds and the Blacks by William Atwood. Same time. So when in it's chapter 14 of Not Yet Uhuru, when Jaramogi talks of indivisible government, he had in mind what the Americans were doing and what they did actually in Limuru.
Because this was also the period of the Cold War, intense Cold War, and the determination of the Americans and the British to contain the African continent.
Yeah.
So we have like progressive leaders like Lumumba being assassinated.
Yes.
So that the radical Pan-Africanism is contained not just by the Comprador component that has taken over power, but also by machinations from the West.
Yes, that Cold War aspect is important because you can also link it to the struggles that come out of Bantu. Because it's the whole question of non-aligned movement and these solidarities outside the new empire, which is the American imperialism, were not welcome, particularly with the Cold War, as you're mentioning, and those alignments. And then we shouldn't forget what happens in Cuba. There's a revolution there. 49, there's a revolution in China.
Correct.
Okay? And as the 60s end, there is a vicious war in Vietnam. Correct. That ends with a revolution in 75. Correct. When they win. Correct. So the Cold War then, even the split of, Korea. Correct. I mean, China and America almost went into war.
So in our conversation of Pan-Africanism then ought to be seen within this larger global...
Yes, and the retreats and the movements forward, the resurrection, as Shibji says it, because it's historicized and contextualized in the sense that, okay, we now have an empire. The Soviet Union in 1989, the Berlin Wall collapses and so forth. And that's how I look at that resurrection. It's as you say, it has to be seen within those changes. Correct. That are happening. Because it's a very powerful, Pan-Africanism is a very powerful narrative. When you look at liberation, you look at land, you look at resources, you look at how Africa is being, raped. No wonder when Rodney wrote how...
Walter Rodney, how Europe underdeveloped Africa.
Yeah, I understand there's somebody else who has written how Africa developed Europe.
Absolutely. And actually such a book is critical because the development of Europe is absolutely driven, and actually the Americas, driven by events on the continent.
Yeah, the stealing that is going on. And, when people talk about welfare capitalism between 45 and 75, before we get to neoliberalism, Shibji says, and I agree with him, people don't say that this welfare happened because of the warfare against the colonized people. That's where the resources came from. Absolutely. To rescue the British ruling classes from their own people.
So extensive extraction, not just of human resources, but actually of natural resources located on the continent. Of course, so what's amazing is the extraction of the resources and then creating Africa as the market for those same resources that were extracted from the continent in the first place.
And that background shows how people who vilify Gaddafi show great ignorance.
So let us talk about Gaddafi. I visited Libya, Sirte, to attend a conference which was taking place then. And I was absolutely shocked to learn so much about the ways in which Gaddafi had made it possible for housing, for healthcare, and for dignified lives, as it were. And then, of course, now there is all these things that happen. What, in your assessment, is Gaddafi's role, or what should we be looking at in terms of his contribution to Pan-Africanism or radical Pan-Africanism?
I think we should glorify it. Horace Kamba has done that.
Yes.
His book on the bombing of Tripoli by NATO, which shows very clearly why Gaddafi and why Libya was just bombed. The connection between Hillary, there's a lot of stuff from Hillary Clinton, Sarkozy,
Yes, the French president.
Yes, the Americans wanting to prop the French also, the issue of the currency, the way it was conceived. And of course, the unity of Africa, whether a lot of people say, he wanted to be president. So why can't he be president? What is the problem? And there's so much propaganda against him.
He wanted, he was thinking more of kind of a federation
Yeah.
of the various states,
Yes.
but with a powerful.
Yes.
I mean, the
Yeah,
Africa continent has like 1 billion people.
Yeah, and I think he combined Nkrumah's vision very well. Basically saying it's a political kingdom. So we have United States of Africa, and we safeguard then our resources, and then within the world, we becoming a multipolar world. We contribute to that so that we're not just ruled by one empire. That, is the case. And you see that idea is coming up again. You see it, the struggles in Russia, the struggles in China. And if you look at that aspect about currency, there is a book I read on currencies. I can't remember the author, but it's called Exorbitant Privilege.
Mm-hmm. Exorbitant Privilege.
Yes. And it talks about the dollar. Mm-hmm. The fact that the American empire is propped up by military and the currency.
You'd call it the tyranny of the dollar.
Yes.
It's almost like really the tyranny of the American dollar in the world.
And people forget that, while we salute the greatness of the Chinese in the creation of a multipolar world, but they haven't dared say their yuan is equal to the
dollar.
No, not yet. And Gaddafi did it before them. Yeah. And the people are not seeing the connection, because the moment, and I think during the war in Ukraine, that aspect came up also.
Oh yeah, it's coming up. I mean,
with the ruble, and you could see how it upset the Americans.
Oh yes.
On issues of what,
because of its ability to destabilize economies.
Yes, and it's the moment we don't allow the American empire to print dollars, and if they print them, it becomes as useless as our currency. That's where Gaddafi's, greatness sits. And I think radical Pan-Africanism, without looking at those issues and completely confronting this propaganda, about his madness. Okay? And if we go back to history, even Kenyatta was called a communist.
Oh, yes.
So the branding,
it minimizes the complexity of the individual and their contribution.
And that's why I was telling Horace, Horace, talk to Kimani Wajogu. This book you have written, it's not available in Kiswahili. It can be translated, and it can be completely popularized. Because it's making an argument that is at the margins, but it's so critical for, radical Pan-Africanism. Because if we are going to resurrect radical Pan-Africanism, what we have decided, that historical trajectory of Nkrumah, of Nyerere. We've talked about unions and people-to-people Pan-Africanism being destroyed because of the state that come up, and what they do since 1963, our leadership in Africa has become captives of the ruling classes of the West. Now the East.
Absolutely. So I want to take you back a little. Radical Pan-Africanism is not going anywhere. It's gaining momentum. I think that there is more consciousness, especially within the context of COVID-19.
Yes.
Black Lives Matter.
Yes.
Roads might fall.
Yes.
All these interesting things.
Yes. Fees must fall. Yes, that one. Yes.
So it seems like radical Pan-Africanism is not going anywhere.
Yeah, because our historians don't track resistance. That is something that annoys me a lot. Because, I think the truth is, where there is domination, exploitation, and oppression and so forth, there is resistance, however minimal.
Absolutely.
There are voices that are saying, this is not right. And historically, you can even trace it within religions. Absolutely. When Jesus and Muhammad started, there were voices in the wilderness.
Absolutely.
But historians tend to be episodic. And
they kind of do not look at the continuities. But it's very interesting because
and the linkages, because that's what Rodney's history is about. He says you cannot start writing about, and I guess Maina Kenyati tries that in his own way. that without Harry Thuku and KCA, okay, without Mekitilili, Wamenza, without the Mau Mau, without the independence movement, and even without KPU, those connections, as you come to the so-called second liberation, nobody is connecting all those dots. And those continuities are very, very, very important, particularly for the youth, to basically see the ebbs and flows, of struggles.
This concludes our first episode in the two-part series of this podcast with Chief Justice Professor Willy Mutunga, President of the Supreme Court of Kenya. Thank you for listening to the Africa Speaking Podcast. Join us in our next episode, brought to you by Twaweza Communications. My name is Kimani Njogu. For any comments and views, you can reach us through our website, www.africaspeaking.org. You can also reach us on Facebook, Twaweza Communications, or on our Twitter handle @TwawezaComs. You can also write to us on email info@africaspeaking.org.